Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first college theme presentation on the Canton campus for the 22-23 academic year. I appreciate the fact that you all took the time to do this. My name is Maher. I teach sociology here at Spoon River College. I may have had some of you in an online class, either currently or in the past. If you do fall into that category, I'd appreciate it if you come introduce yourself afterwards. I'd like to meet you. So, you've seen the green posters up around college campus. What is this, and why am I here? Okay, first of all, what is this? The faculty at Spoon River College have sponsored a college theme for the past 13 years. My colleagues in the back will be using the theme in various ways in their classes. Some will be connecting assignments or projects to the college theme. Others may be just simply referencing it, but all of us will be encouraging you to come to these college theme presentations, and I would encourage you all to be back here on Tuesday, September the 13th, when Professor Becky Leverett will be giving her presentation. Why am I here? Do you remember the excitement you had, like the first day of kindergarten, the first day of second grade, third grade? You remember how fun school used to be? Remember that? Like, see if you can mentally tap into that. Because for far too many of you, you had that fun and excitement schooled out of you by the time you got to high school. We're here to rekindle that. And my colleagues and I are going to be encouraging you all year long to start elevating curiosity to the learning process, because it is fundamental to what you are doing here. So, I've already explained to you that I am a sociologist. So, the title of my presentation might be a source of curiosity. Mapped out, the curious case of cartography. So, just to alleviate any confusion in case there is any, cartography, map making. I have a very specific interest in cartography that is connected to what I do as a sociologist. Full disclosure, I am not a geographer. My geography knowledge is very, very poor. So I'm going to be very specific here, and I'm going to try really hard not to get outside my lane. Mapping the world is way more problematic than you may assume. And there are two fundamental problems with maps. The first is a technical problem of how to depict on a two-dimensional flat surface a three-dimensional spherical object. Imagine, if you will, that I hand you all a bunch of oranges and I ask you all to peel that orange, but to peel it so that it remains in one piece. Imagine all the different configurations your orange peels would have. Not to mention the fact that they would not lie flat. You'd have to scrunch it down, and in the process of scrunching it down, you would inevitably distort shape and size. That's a technical problem. The second is really what hits home for me as a sociologist. The second is a cultural problem. Whose worldview is the map going to reflect? Who is the cartographer? At what point in time in history? What intention did she have in putting this particular map together? Because these two issues are inseparable. The projection that one uses inevitably makes a statement about how a person views one's own people and their place in the world. Now, I'm going to come back around to that connection in just a little bit. But first, you ever seen a map like this? Yes, everybody is basically shaking their head. Yes, this is a very, very common map. Most of you probably had it in your textbooks throughout high school. Does anybody know what kind of map this is? It's a Mercator map. Okay? It was developed in the 1500s, and it was developed for a very, very specific purpose. Does anybody happen to know what that purpose is? To navigate the ocean. As a tool by which to navigate the ocean, the Mercator map is fantastic, which of course, 1500, 1600, it's kind of important you don't get lost, right, if you're going to navigate the ocean. The thing is that if Mercator were alive today and he saw the ways in which this map is being used, he would be dumbfounded, because this is not what he intended. So take a look at the Mercator map, and I just want to point out to you a couple of very curious things about this. First of all, look at the continent of Africa. Now compare that with the landmass of Greenland. Would it shock anyone to know that the continent of Africa is actually 14 times larger than Greenland? You would never know that from looking at the map, would you? Oh, and by the way, there are fewer than 60,000 people living in Greenland. There are 1.4 billion people in the continent of Africa. Look at Alaska. Compare the size of Alaska with the size of Mexico. Mexico is actually larger in land area than Alaska. So you see what's happening with the Mercator map is that the size near the poles is getting enlarged and minimized near the equator. So there's one fundamental problem with this. Now, like I said, as a navigation tool, it's great, it's wonderful. And by the way, to the best of my knowledge, this is what Google Earth uses, because it's still functional on that level. As a point of comparison, here is the Peters projection map, which is an equal area map. This is the map that is adopted by the United Nations because, well, of its equal area projection. In that sense, from their perspective, it is a more equal, equitable, just way by which to represent the world and the world's people. Here is yet another version of an equal area projection map, just to get another version of it. Nice. Yeah, I love this map. I love this map. I don't know, language is just so curious to me, Like when you get in the car and you head north and we say things like, I'm gonna head up north. I'm gonna go down south. South is not down. South is south. North is not up. North is north. No matter how you choose to project it on a two-dimensional flat surface. I mean, do you think the folks in Australia are ever tired of getting referred to as down under? I mean, seriously, like if I were an Australian, I would welcome that. Placing Australia at the top, at the center. Do we have an unconscious sort of bias for our site to go to the top or to go to the center? And if we do, does it kind of matter whether a cartographer puts this nation or that nation at the top or the center? Does it cause us to think about those nations, those cultures, those people in different ways? Do we associate size with superiority? If we do, we better be thinking about this. I like this map for a couple of other reasons as well. When I look at that map, what I see is water. What percent of the planet is water? 71%. 71% is water. Of all of the water in the hydrologic cycle, how much of it is potable water? How much of it is fresh water for our use? What percent? About 1.2%. Let that sink in for a little while, because whether you're aware of it or not, we are no longer looking at an impending water crisis. The water crisis is real. It is happening. There are states within the United States who are in conflict with one another legally over access to rivers. We're pumping aquifers at rates that the natural hydrologic cycle cannot replenish it. This is a problem, and it's a problem that needs our immediate attention. The question becomes, does a map like that perhaps get us to think more carefully, more clearly about water? Oh, and by the way, if you're thinking that desalination is going to solve that problem, you might want to think very carefully about that, because desalination is incredibly energy intensive. Here's another version. The world turned upside down, slightly shifted. Now Africa is straight in the center of the map. Would that cause you to maybe think about the world in a different way? Okay. The next slide that I'm going to show you is the most important part of this. If you get nothing else out of today, let it be this. Does anybody know the artist? Oh, Jamie knows. Who is it, Jamie?
It's Rene Magritte.
All right, it is Magritte. And if you don't mind a follow-up question, is it fairly atypical for an artist to include text?
Well, around his time, it started to become more prevalent. But up until then,
Okay.
it was a no-go.
Okay, all right. So you can see the image, you can see the text. This is not a pipe. Does anybody disagree with Magritte? Does anybody think this is a pipe? Oh, I see. Nobody disagrees with this. Well, in that case, explain to me why it's perhaps correct. How is this not a pipe?
Picture of a pipe.
It's a picture of a pipe. It's the way in which an artist has chosen to represent the physical object of a pipe. If you say that that's a pipe, then my challenge to you is, be my guest, go up and smoke it. Give it a shot. Please don't set the building on fire. But, give it a shot. So no, it's not a pipe. It's a painting of a pipe. But I can even push it even further because it's not even a painting of a pipe. What are you looking at right now? You're looking at an electronic image of a painting of a pipe. And Jamie, correct me if I'm wrong, but the original version of this was French, correct?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So it's already been translated for you as well. So it's not a pipe. Reality is not what you think it is. Now, do you make the connection between what I am trying to tell you here? This is not the world, you guys. This is the way someone has chosen to represent the world. And you need to be curious enough at all times to be asking those questions. Again, who is this cartographer? Do they have a specific interest in mind behind making this particular map? Is it fostering certain ideas about certain people in the world that I otherwise would not have? Okay, so now I'm circling back around. I'm a sociologist. Why do I care about cartography? Why do I care about the representation of the world in this way? Well, because as a sociologist, I talk about issues like ethnocentrism, the tendency to assume cultural superiority over other groups, this value judgments that we have a tendency to make based upon our own group and what we know. And I have to think carefully about how representations of the world may foster ethnocentrism, or get me to think differently about various issues of stratification, whether they be class-based or race-based or gender-based or sexual orientation or whatever they may be. I'm dealing with issues of inequality all the time, and I have to think carefully about how that inequality can be reinforced through the projections of the map that I choose to use in the classroom. Because this is ultimately about equity, about creating a level playing field, a playing field that is right now decidedly not level because of the history that we have inherited. This is your task as college students, is to think carefully about these things in the time that you've got it. Maps often shape our perception of reality as much as they reflect it. Every projection causes a distortion in some shape or form. I am not here lobbying today for one of the previous maps that I showed you over the Mercator map. What I'm really urging you to do is diversify the representations of the world that you choose to use. A map that shows the shape of land masses correctly will necessarily misrepresent the size. So keep that in mind when you're looking at an equal area map. A map that is accurate along the equator will be deceptive at the poles. So map making is inseparable from power. All right. I don't know why this is not working very well. So this is going to be a little bit difficult for you to see real well from where you sit. But here's another version. And this map is made up of teeny tiny little squares. And if you could read it, it would tell you that each little square represents 500,000 people. So this map is an attempt to represent the world based upon population size. So in case you can't see it, that's China, 1.4 billion. Here's India, 1.3 billion. So again, ask yourself, if you were looking at a map like this, would it cause you to think about international policy differently? Would it cause you to think about global issues differently if you were sort of forced to confront the sheer size of populations of places in the world that oftentimes we don't think much about? Here's a version of the real world given everything that I have just told you. It's got its advantages, it's got its disadvantages, but nonetheless, it's a version of the real world. That's the world we created. If I could somehow give you like a time-lapse version of that over the last 400 or 500 years, of course what you would see is those borders shape-shifting all over the place. And if I could do that, it would probably sort of further emphasize this point that we are creating this world. That is what you are doing here. That is what my colleagues and I are going to be doing in terms of trying to get you to think about curiosity and how it is tied to learning. You got to be curious about this. If you're not curious about this, you're not going to understand what's happening and why. If you are curious about this and you start to think carefully about this history and what went into this, what will it do? It will empower you, both individually and collectively, to make change. And who knows, maybe even a brighter day. So, that's 15 minutes. I want to pause for a second and give the students an opportunity here. Comments, questions, observations. Did you learn anything that you didn't know before? Yes?
With desalinization, you said it's incredibly energy sucking, but they're more efficient ways of doing it, such as with mineral waste.
Right. Right. And I know that those alternative energies are out there and that technology is developing. I think obviously we need to do that. We need to approach, we need to keep doing that. But I tend to be somewhat leery of that sort of technological utopianism. This idea that technology is always going to be there to save us, and instead I prefer to spend my time trying to focus on the fact that we have to change the way we live. We have to change the way our society is organized, right, in order to preserve that hydrologic cycle. Anyone else? Comment or question? Yes.
Just jump on that little bandwagon.
Yeah.
Energy is not the only problem. It produces a massive amount of waste. You gotta do something with salt. And that's a problem. Along with all the organisms over in the water that you just killed to get the salt and stuff out. So energy is the fastest, to pick on to, but there's a lot of other things.
All right. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Any other students? Comments? Questions? Yes.
How do you feel about paper towns? Have you heard of those?
No.
Okay, so back when people were making maps a lot, cartographers would insert a paper town, which isn't a real town, but they would put it on there to see who copied their map, because it's not really there. It doesn't exist.
Oh, that's interesting. No, I didn't know anything about that, but thank you. I appreciate it. See, I just learned something. That's great. Anybody else? How about my colleagues? Any comments or questions from my colleagues?
How about the coloring of the maps?
All right, so Dr. Zellman has raised this question about, how does the color of certain nations on the map impact our perceptions? Are there certain colors that we gravitate towards or sort of associate with superiority, inferiority? It is a question I had not yet considered, but it's a good one. Anyone else? Yeah.
The placement for that being even more to do.
Mm-hmm. Is yet another factor, right? Another variable? Yes. Anyone else? Yes.
This is all about people. There's ecosystems that, have a right to be here and considered and recognized that our borders don't account for.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
What are some ways where we could tell people how to help with the water crisis?
Oh boy. Okay, I'm trying to answer that. Obviously, it's important to make individual decisions within your own lives in terms of water usage and consumption. But at some point, you all have to kind of figure out what's going on politically in terms of legislation and policy as it relates to water infrastructure, right? And so that involves your voice as a voter, of supporting budgets to replace that water infrastructure. Our water infrastructure in this country is old and dilapidated, especially in the eastern portion of the United States. In some cases it's 100 years old, right? But that takes public money to do that. So,
I guess I phrased my question wrong. I meant like big companies, how to educate big companies on.
Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, the question was how to change companies' behavior around the water. Go ahead, Doug.
I was just going to say,
mentioned voting power and so forth. Is there a population-based map of the United States itself, state by state? Because that would be interesting as well, not just country by country, but...
Right. Now, it's interesting you brought that up, because for one split second when I was putting this together, I almost searched for an electoral map that did this in terms of population instead of the standard congressional district thing that we typically look at in terms of, red and blue, or for that matter, one that is more nuanced, that shows all of the shades of purple that exist in this country, where it's not just red and blue. So yeah, that's another example of representation. Yeah.
How can younger generations, such as like Gen Z, influence older generations?
That is an uphill battle always when it comes to any issue, right? Because, it seems to me, historically speaking, most change occurs from one generation to the next rather than within a particular generation. And clearly, your generation is squarely now dealing with the failures of previous generations who have kicked this can down the road for far too long. And like I said about the water crisis, it's no longer impending, it's happening. It's no longer about impending climate change, it's happening. And what I would just end with and urge you all to do is to keep this in the forefront of your mind. This is why you are in college. You are never going to have another opportunity in your life to be this curious and to have the time and the access to my colleagues and what they know. Take advantage of this and continue to come back to these presentations, please. Thank you very much for being here today.